Hello APUSH scholars, welcome to review video number 3 on the theme peopling. First of all, many of you are probably wondering, what in the world is peopling? Did you make that word up? And no, I didn't, but I think that perhaps the College Board did. I'm kidding. I don't know. The lady who did my institute this summer swore that is now what college professors use to describe migrations. I don't know if it's politically correct, or perhaps it's meant to be more descriptive of what's happening rather than just a migration. I think we often think of immigration, perhaps, and it's also trying to include the idea of internal migration as well. Anyway, what the theme is asking about is migrations to the United States and internally in the United States, and then how that has impacted the development of the United States. It also mentions in here to consider how people responded when borders crossed them, meaning like westward expansion, when we took land from Mexico or took over Hawaii or Alaska or something like that, where people who had already been there, of course, then were taken into the United States. The way that the themes are designed is that there are two overarching questions about the theme. And the two questions here are, why have people migrated to, from, and within North America? And then, how have changes in migration and population patterns affected American life? Going along with the overarching questions are 7 learning objectives. They kind of break the questions down into smaller pieces. There are 3 learning objectives that go along with the first question, and 4 that go along with the second question. And then each learning objective can be applied to a number of units that we've studied. Question 1 asks, why have people migrated to, from, and within North America? And then, like I said, there are 3 learning objectives. You don't necessarily need to write these down now if you're looking at your outline. I haven't listed the learning objectives here. We'll talk about them individually as we go through the review. But what you want to write here is that learning objectives peopling 1, 2, and 3 go along with question 1. And then question 2, how have changes in migration and population patterns affected American life? And then learning objectives peopling 4, peopling 5, peopling 6, and peopling 7 go along with this question. So you want to write that down, but not necessarily the entire objective. Why these are important and why we're going through the review this way, of course, is that the way that questions are structured on the AP exam all goes back to these learning objectives and themes. So what happens is, when you write a multiple choice question or when you write an essay question, you first look at the learning objective, and then you add the historical skill in, and then you go to the key concept of the different unit you're wanting to ask the question about, and you create the question from there. So if you understand all of these learning objectives and the key concept information that goes along with those learning objectives, you should be able to get any question right on this topic. So let's start with peopling 1. Explain how and why people moved within the Americas, and this is asking before contact, and to and within the Americas after contact and colonization. For peopling 1, this addresses only Unit 1 and 2, and it mostly addresses the way that the skill could be applied is they could ask you a causation question, so why are people migrating, compare and contrast, why different groups migrated, or it could be a change over time, which is essentially compare and contrast over time with Unit 1 and 2. So key concept that addresses this for Unit 1 is basically asking why groups are migrating within North America. And what it's looking at is that this is really before many of the European groups have moved into North America. You see a little bit in Mexico, and that's about it at this point. And mostly you just have native groups, and they're migrating essentially to find food and animals and that sort of thing. Now on this map, what you see is that the purple, these people have developed agriculture. And what the main source of agriculture is maize. And then you have in the middle and the western part of the country and is hunting and gathering. This area is not exactly suitable for agriculture, and so they more find food through hunting and gathering, so they're going to migrate probably in a seasonal pattern in order to find food. The agricultural groups are not going to migrate as much. They may, as populations get larger, migrate, or if they ruin the soil and the fertility of the soil, if they face bad weather situations, then they'll migrate. If you remember, we also studied the Iroquois and the Algonquin, over in the northeastern part of North America. And the Algonquin and Iroquois were kind of a mix between hunting and gathering and agriculture. So you saw some migration there as they looked for animals to hunt and that sort of thing. But a definitely seasonal migrational pattern. Then there's also the fishing and gathering people of the West that we looked at as well. Now in Unit 2, things begin to get a little more complex as you have Europeans arriving in North America. So you have reasons for immigration as well as migrations within the country. The first group to immigrate into the Americas is the Spanish. And their motivations, we've talked about many times, gold, God, and glory. They're coming over wanting to convert people to Catholicism and to get rich. This is going to result in a lot of intermarriage because you have mostly men coming over. You have the conquistadors, people coming over to run businesses and to represent the Spanish government, and then also priests. And so there's going to be a lot of intermarriage with the natives, and then also the areas that they're settling in South America, Central America, they're going to run into more largely populated areas, and so they're going to have to learn to live amongst the natives. Some natives are not very welcoming of the Spanish and do not want to live on missions and things like that. So they begin to migrate away from the Spanish settlements. So you see that migration as well as the Spanish moving into the area. The Spanish are not as influential in North America as they are in South America. However, they do have some land holdings in the southwestern United States and in Florida, which will lead to clashes with the French and the British. The French come into North America to expand their empire and to get involved in the fur trade. Their numbers are not as big as the British. They have small settlements in Canada and along the Mississippi and Ohio rivers and down into New Orleans. The communities they build are small, and they build a partnership with the Native Americans in the fur trade. They do have impact on the natives as they introduce the natives into the European marketplace and have them become reliant on trade with the Europeans, introduce alcohol, which is harmful to them. They do try to convert on some level to Catholicism, and that's met with some resistance. But overall, the French don't push a lot of natives out because, first of all, they're encountering natives in small numbers, and then they're working together with them rather than making them feel like they need to leave. For some reason, my slides are out of order, so we're going to talk about the British. But first, we're going to talk about the overall impact of the Europeans. The Europeans come in basically looking for economic opportunities. And their economic opportunities are going to have to include the natives. And therefore, the natives are brought into the overall system of the European economy and become reliant on selling things to the Europeans and also buying European products. Another thing that's going to be created to serve the European economy is the need for cheap labor. And that's going to lead to more migrations. They find early on that the natives aren't really the greatest form of cheap labor, and also that there's really not enough natives in North America for what they need. So that leads to slaves and indentured servants. The other thing that happens is that the Europeans moving in is going to lead to a lot of Native American migration and a lot of fighting amongst the Europeans and the natives within native groups. And the natives find that one way to maintain some sort of power is to play the Europeans off one another with alliances. And two examples of that would be the Beaver Wars and the Chickasaw Wars. The Beaver Wars involves the Iroquois and the Algonquin, and pretty much they're fighting over fur trading lands in the Ohio River Valley and playing French and British alliances and Dutch off one another. The Iroquois align themselves with the British, and the British give them weapons, and they're fighting the Algonquin tribes, and therefore also the French, because the Algonquin have an alliance with the French. The Chickasaw Wars, the Chickasaw have an alliance with the British, and they're fighting the Choctaw, who have an alliance with the French. And ultimately what this leads to is a lot more brutal warfare because they're given British and French weapons. It leads to more migrations as people, the other native groups who aren't involved, want to escape the violence, so they move south or west to get out of their way. Going back to the British now, the British are migrating for economic opportunity and religious freedom. Go back and study your different colonies and why they were founded for specific examples of both. And they're looking for permanent settlement. And because a lot of them are coming over and looking for permanent settlement, they are bringing their entire families. And because of this, you're going to see families settling. There's not as much need to interact with the natives, so you don't have a lot of intermarriage, creating new cultural groups. And that's also going to lead to separation because they don't interact with the natives as much because they're not intermarrying. They create separate societies, and therefore they're going to push the natives west as they settle along the Atlantic coast. The overall impact of the European migration is that there's going to be a lot of conflict over resources, and that this is going to lead to that as the Europeans expand their colonial settlements in North America, they're going to clash with each other and bring the natives into their clash. Overall, with peopling, with Learning Objective Peopling 1, what you're going to see questions about is the early natives and why they moved around and what their lives were like. You're going to see questions about why the Europeans were settling and about conflict. You may also see a periodization question that has to do with the migration, that why they picked 1607, because there were Europeans in North America before 1607, especially in the southwest area with the Spanish. But what's most important to the creation of the history of the United States is probably the British migration, which begins in 1607. You could also see change over time, that the migrations are happening because of Europeans after 1607, rather than it being just about the natives moving around for food. continuity, violence continues, that the natives had clashed with one another before over resources. They're going to continue to do that, but it's, of course, going to be a change in that it's highly intensified by the Europeans, and the Europeans giving them better weapons and intensifying the fight over the land. Moving on to learning objective peopling number 2. This is going to deal with the 19th and 20th century, so after the initial European migration. Explain how changes in the numbers and sources of international migrants in the 19th and 20th centuries altered the ethnic and social makeup of the U.S. population. So for peopling number 2, the time periods addressed are pretty much every time period after the first 3. So once the United States has become a country and established itself, and as it begins to grow, how is migration impacting its growth? All of the historical skills can be addressed here: causation, compare and contrast, change over time, and periodization. Here are the key concepts for Unit 4 that relate to peopling number 2. And just to go back and talk about the structure of this for a moment and the rest of the presentation, for each learning objective can be addressed in a number of units. And the key concepts are a little more specific information about what should be addressed in each time period. So I've put these in here for you because it kind of gives you an idea. Some of the verbiage for questions comes from these key concepts as well as the learning objectives. And then I've put these on a slide, and then the slides that follow provide some more specific information that you would want to know if you were writing an essay or a short answer question, basically evidence that supports the key concept and the learning objective, or may provide some more information for a multiple choice question. This slide, unfortunately, is out of order again. I don't know what happened. I apologize. So this is the Unit 5 information, the key concept information. Now this is going back to Unit 4 and the key concepts of Unit 4. This is an elaboration on that information. In Unit 4, what we begin to see, it starts in 1800, is the growth of the national economy. The country has gotten itself established and begins to become more integrated. And what you're seeing at this point is regional economic specialization. The South is producing cotton. The West, and what we're meaning by West at this point, is like Ohio and places like that, maybe Illinois. We're not talking about California. They're producing raw materials for industry, which is in the north, and then they're also providing food for cities in the north. So a lot of the regional integration at this point is between the old Northwest and the Northeast, and then the South is providing the cotton for the North. They're not as integrated as the Northeast and the old Northwest. You're starting to see immigrants come from different places. So this is where the idea of periodization, when looking at different places that people, the shift in who the new immigrants are. And this is when the Irish and the Germans begin to make their way into the United States. And with that, and they're coming because there's opportunity for land and also to work in American factories. The Irish are going to be more the ones who stay in the cities along the Atlantic seaboard and work in factories, where the Germans often have a little bit more money. They're looking for new opportunity. They're trying to get away from the more autocratic rule in Germany. And so often they have money to buy land, where the Irish barely have enough money to make it over into the United States. So it's more rare that they go and establish. And therefore, the Irish are going to create Irish parts of cities because there's going to be large numbers of immigrants there, where the Germans are going to go settle and kind of integrate themselves into agricultural communities. Some will stay in the cities and kind of do the same thing as the Irish. With the growth of the economy, you also see the emergence, and it's not huge, but the beginning emergence of middle class and working class groups of people. Most immigrants do not settle in the South. There's not a lot of opportunity there for them. The slave trade at this point is over. The Constitution and the agreements in the Constitution end the slave trade. However, there is still an internal slave trade because demand for slaves remains high in the South. The other migration during this period is going to be that the government is going to force many natives west onto reservations in order to exploit resources in the land that's been settled by the Americans. This slide has to do with Unit 5 and the key concept explanation for Unit 5. Unit 5 starts in 1844 and spans till 1877, so it's the build-up right before the Civil War and then what happens after the Civil War, right, the Reconstruction era. The Irish, the immigration grows larger as Unit 4 progresses into Unit 5, and the Irish, again, they're settling in the major cities, mostly doing industrial work, and then they're also willing, anything anybody else is not willing to do, the Irish will do. They often settle in ethnic communities, and they want to hang on to their own culture. One of the things that the Irish find, and the biggest thing that differentiates the Irish from settlers before, is that they're not Protestant, they're Catholic. And what they find about American schools is that it strongly indoctrinates a Protestant ethic and moral background. And so Irish families begin to create parochial schools or Catholic schools in the United States in order to teach their children Catholic values. There's also a significant backlash against the Irish that develops nativist policies. No Irish need apply and things such as that. One of the most famous groups against immigration and the Irish is the Know Nothings. They're a political party, and they're known as the Know Nothings because they were very secretive, and when asked about their party, they would say, "I know nothing." The westward expansion also relates to Unit number 5, and what is happening between 1844 and 1877 is large numbers of people are moving west before and after the Civil War. After the Civil War, many people flock west because of the Homestead Act, offering free land to anybody who can farm the land for a certain number of years. There's also gold rushes before and after the Civil War that lead people to hope to get rich quick. Not only are people who had already been settled in America moving west, but you also have immigrants who are immediately heading west. Europeans and Chinese are also migrating to the west coast of North America. Chinese laborers are working on railroads that are being built out west. They are trying to find gold, and they're also settling in cities in California and places like that. As Americans move west, the clashes with the natives increase significantly. These relate Sand Creek and Little Bighorn more to Unit number 6, and we'll come back to those a little bit later. During this period, you also see Mormons who come in and who move west. They had been persecuted for their religious beliefs in New York and Illinois, so they head to Utah to create a Mormon settlement there where they won't be persecuted anymore. You also see examples of borders crossing people with the natives and the Hispanics during this time period. One example of what's happening in the southwestern United States is Mariano Vallejo. What's happened is that in the 1840s there was the Mexican-American War, and the United States won territory in New Mexico and in Arizona and California. And Americans are moving into that territory, and they want to be the primary landowners and to take advantage of the new land. However, there had already been Mexican landowners there. The Americans were supposed to respect their land ownership, but what they do to people like Mariano Vallejo is they throw him in jail, and then they begin to confiscate his land. And over time, he loses most of his land to Americans. Here's the key concept for Unit 6. In Unit 6, you see a significant increase in immigration to the country as the economy grows significantly as it recovers from the Civil War. You also see a shift, so periodization would be a key thing here as well, because you see a shift from immigrants from Northern Europe, Western Europe, to Southern and Eastern Europe, people from Greece, Italy, Poland, places like Russia, and from Asia. They're moving to urban areas, and again, like the Irish, they're going to settle into communities that are segregated, where they feel welcomed. And as they become more established, and I believe you looked at a whole settlement house and how it changed over time as groups became more established in the city and moved on up into better housing in a better part of the city, and then the newest immigrants come in and live in kind of substandard housing in the poorest areas of the city. One thing that begins to happen here is that groups begin to develop to help out the immigrants who are struggling and who are being paid low wages by big corporations and things such as that. One group is the political machines, who help out people who are new to the country, help them get jobs, help them find a place to live, all in exchange for votes for their political party. Settlement houses, the strongest example there is Jane Addams' Hull House, but Hull Houses develop all over the place, and basically what they're doing, they are not necessarily places for immigrants to live, but they're places where immigrants can go to get training, to find childcare, to learn English. It's basically a support system for the natives, not necessarily a place where they live. You also see organizations like the Women's Christian Temperance Union, who are working to abolish alcohol in the country. This was a huge issue in the cities and with immigrants, and so this was also, the women are working to improve the conditions in the cities, violence in the cities, violence against women and children, and so that's what that organization was for. Although life is not easy for immigrants to the United States, they do find that the wages in America are better than the wages for laborers in Europe. They also find that even though they're not treated very well, there's opportunity in America. Here's the key concepts for Unit 7. The big regarding peopling or immigration is the Immigration Act of 1924. Americans are very worried about increasing immigration to the United States from Asia and Southern and Eastern Europe. They fear that immigrants are changing the face of America, and so they want to put limits on who can come in and try to keep America looking the same as it always has. And so what they end up doing is putting quotas on European immigration based on the population in the 1890 census. They ban immigration from Asia. However, they do allow unrestricted immigration from the Western Hemisphere because they want cheap labor. And so that's going to result in a larger number of people from the Western Hemisphere coming in, but it's going to limit the number of immigrants from other parts of the world. Here's the key concept for Unit 8. In Unit 8, you see a change in immigration law, the immigration law of 1965. This is the first immigration law since 1924. And what it does is it removes the quotas that were put in place in the 1920s because those quotas are seen as unacceptable in the era of civil rights. Kennedy thought they were unacceptable and had begun to work to change the immigration law in the country. And then after he dies, Johnson takes over the cause and gets the immigration law of 1965 passed. What the immigration law of 1965 does is it still puts a limit on the number of people that can come into the country, but it gives preferences to certain groups rather than limiting who can come in from certain groups. It values skills. So if you have a job skill that will help America or that's in short supply in America, you are going to be welcome. And it puts an emphasis on family reunification and refugees, because this is the Cold War era. So anybody who's coming from a place like, for instance, Cuba, where evil commies have come to power, we will welcome you into the United States. What you see is that at this point, again, another periodization issue is that the shift in the American immigrant is going to change again. You're going to see a lot less Europeans and more people from Asia and Latin America and Africa. Immigrants are coming to America because they want to seek access to the huge economic growth that's happened post-World War II in the United States. Here's the key concept for Unit 9. By the 1980s, the big issue with immigration was the number of people who had come into the country undocumented. They were illegal immigrants. And so the Immigration Reform Act of 1986 is passed to try to deal with illegal immigration. What they want to do is more strictly enforce immigration law. This law makes it illegal to hire someone who's undocumented in this country, and they grant amnesty to people who qualified and who were undocumented or illegal immigrants in the country before 1982. So they grant amnesty to them and then try to begin to deal with anybody new who comes into the country who's undocumented. Then in 1990, the government decides that they're going to increase the number of legal immigrants who are allowed into the country every year to 700,000. And they kind of shift some of the 1965 law to give preference, again, to different groups, those that are underrepresented immigrants to the country, and they continue to enforce the ideas of family reunification and job skills. In 1996, further legislation about illegal immigration was passed. The Illegal Immigrant Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act was passed, and this is a fairly complex piece of legislation, but ultimately what it's doing is in making stronger penalties for people who are caught in this country illegally. Overall, what you can see over the last 30 years, that the discussion has become about legal versus illegal immigration with regard to immigration in this country. If you were writing a change over time about immigration, one of the things that you could use for synthesis would be the executive order of President Obama granting amnesty to certain people who qualified trying to deal with illegal immigration. Now, one thing you want to note is that all of that has been put on hold. Nothing has actually happened with that because people are questioning the executive order and the constitutionality of what Obama did. So nothing's happened yet, but kind of the idea of it could be used as synthesis. This brings us finally to the end of Peopling 2. Couple of thoughts about this as we wrap that up. The way that this, you could get multiple choice questions about this, but it could be a pretty good essay question in terms of compare and contrast or change over time, or even periodization, as I've pointed out kind of as we've gone through this learning objective. If you got change over time, it would probably be about the different groups. Again, Peopling number 2 is asking about international migrations in the 19th and 20th centuries and how it altered the ethnic and social makeup of the U.S. population. So probably asking you about the different groups and their impact. The shift from Western European Protestant to the Irish Catholic and the Germans, and then on to Eastern and Southern Europeans and the Chinese and Japanese. So that could be a question. The other thing that you might see is compare and contrast, especially early on, between Irish and German immigrants. That might be something you would see. So there are a number of essay questions that could come from this. One thing to note about immigration in general is that before 1965, especially for Units 8 and 9, is that the population of the United States was 85% white or of European descent. By 2009, with the changes in of legislation after 1965, 1/3 of the people in the United States were minorities. And then is projected by 2042 that non-whites in the United States will be the majority. And now on to Peopling number 3. Analyze the causes and effects of major internal migration patterns such as urbanization, suburbanization, westward movement, and the Great Migration in the 19th and 20th centuries. So this one, the first one was asking, like, how are things like before Europeans? How are people migrating? And then what was the impact of the Europeans? Then the second question is saying, okay, once we're settled, how do new people coming in impact the settlement of the United States? And now this one is asking you, all right, what were the different internal migrations once the country is established? So the time periods addressed in this one are Unit 4, Unit 6, 7, 8, and 9. And all of the historical skills, or all the different types of essays, could be addressed here. Here are the key concepts for Unit 4. Before we get into the specifics about Unit 4, a little organizational issue again. For this particular learning objective, it's asking about cause and effect, and then it's asking about internal migration, urbanization, suburbanization, westward movement, and the Great Migration. So what I've done within each unit is addressed all of the issues that apply. They don't always apply to each unit, but when they do, I've tried to address them separately, because what you could see here is an essay question asking you about just one of these things, like urbanization. I've seen one on the Great Migration and asking, what are the effects of the Great Migration in the 20th century. Also, you could see multiple choice questions about these different aspects as well. So in Unit 4, one of the areas that is addressed is urbanization. So Unit 4, this is pre-Civil War. This is again the establishment of industrialization in this country. So people are going to start moving to the cities to take industrial jobs. And as we mentioned before, food's going to come from the Midwest, cotton from the South, and then industrial areas in the North and the Midwest, or the Old Northwest, or whatever you want to call it. The effects of urbanization at this time, again, the emerging middle and working class. You start to see early forms of labor unions, people beginning to realize that maybe they're not getting as much of a piece of the pie as the owners of the factories are. You see a separation between home and work life. That if you live in the city and you go to work in a factory, that your work is no longer with you all the time like it is when you're living on a farm. That once your workday is done, you come home and you have leisure time. And that's going to become a bigger deal over time as the working class and the urbanization grows larger. This is also the time that the cult of domesticity is developed, because you also see the emergence of the middle class growing strong in urban areas. These are people who have more skilled jobs, and it becomes kind of a symbol of that you're doing well economically if your wife stays home and does not work outside the home, and she becomes the leader in the household, the moral leader, as well as taking care of all domestic duties, and that's called the cult of domesticity. And as immigrants come in and settle in the cities, you also see a nativist movement as Americans feel that their culture is being threatened by new groups of people coming in, as well as competition for jobs. You also see the theme of westward expansion in Unit 4. People are beginning to move west, trying to find new opportunity. They're moving west to farm, and they're moving west to work in Midwestern cities. At this time, this is the time of westward expansion. New states are being formed and territories, and so there's new opportunities for settlement, for people to get out of overcrowded areas or to own land where they couldn't own land in more established states in the East and the South. New roads and canals that are being built allow for quicker travel, safer travel to these new areas. And then there's the gold rush that happens, several gold rushes that happen, and people run to the west to try to get wealthy quickly. The effects of Western expansion are going to be increasing democracy. You'll recall the era of Jackson and the common man. Voting rights expand as people have the opportunity to move west, and as those western territories become states, new landowners become voters, and so then in the East, they have to change their laws so that they don't lose population, so people can vote even if they don't own land. And so you see this common man democracy that's forming, where it's not just the elite who are participating in in governing the country, and in also voting for leaders in the country. New patterns of family life develop as people move west. A lot of them abandon their extended family and have to form new community bonds. Regional concerns are still the most important concerns in the country before the Civil War. As people expand west, one of the big debates that comes up is whether slavery should expand with them, and whether new territories should be allowed based on whether they're going to allow slavery or not. Another debate that comes from the westward expansion movement is internal improvements. People who settle in the West are very much for internal improvements because they benefit them, like building new roads and things like that, and funded by the American government. But people in more established areas are like, why are we spending money on that? Why do we need to help those people? So there's still a lot of regional concern going on. Here are the key concepts for Unit 6. As we already discussed in Unit 6, urbanization is a big deal after the Civil War as the economy of the country grows, as well as immigration is a big deal in the cities at this time. The effects, we've already sort of mentioned before, immigrants are going to find different areas of the city to live in, and they're going to want to maintain a certain aspect of their own culture. We'll talk more about immigration and culture and how it affects America when we talk about the American identity. Other effects that are going to happen are that African Americans, especially freed slaves, are going to find their way to the cities in the north to take advantage of labor opportunities in the factories. While there is a lot of economic opportunity in these cities, what they're going to find is that they're still going to face discrimination. Overall, workers find that the living conditions in the cities are not all that wonderful. And again, there's going to be certain groups that are going to be developed to help them, like settlement houses and political machines. Westward expansion continues after the Civil War. The Homestead Act, more gold rushes and other opportunities present themselves out west, and people are going to flock there. One of the things that you see is by the end of the 19th century, Frederick Jackson Turner is going to publish his frontier thesis, arguing that the frontier is closed. There's also going to be concerns about losing access to new lands, and that's going to lead to the conservation and preservation movement, which we'll talk more about when we present the environmental theme. However, remember that some of these themes overlap, and so when you're talking about peopling, that those ideas can be brought into the discussion of peopling. Another issue that's going to become a big thing is the difference between farming communities and industrial communities. So urban areas versus rural. Farmers are going to find that they are not as important as the big businesses and the cities. And they're going to grow frustrated at things like freight cost, where big businesses get the preference and they're losing money on paying high freight cost. And so and also they're more reliant on machinery, and agribusiness begins to grow as large farms become more profitable than the small family farm. Loans from big banking in the big cities. The farmers are going to want more friendly loan terms and access to inflation and things like that. And so groups like the Grange, which protect farmers' rights, which grow into the Populist Party, are going to form during this time period. Here's the key concept for Unit 7. In the 20th century, cities are going to continue to grow, and new cities are going to spring up as the population grows and expands. The other issue that comes up is that more labor is going to be needed, especially during World War I and World War II, to meet the needs of wartime production. And then the effects of this new urbanization are going to be that you're going to see new cities growing, especially in the Sun Belt, as defense contracts are given to areas in the Sun Belt. Remember, the Sun Belt is the smiley face that grows across the southern United States from Virginia all the way to California. Another important internal migration that happens in the early 20th century is the Great Migration. This is the migration of African Americans to northern cities. This mainly starts with World War I and the need for laborers in the factories. So African Americans begin to move to northern cities, and then it's going to continue throughout the 1920s. The effects of this are that you're going to see African Americans settling in African American areas of urban areas, and one of the most famous is Harlem in New York City. And they create their own communities in these areas. And in Harlem, you see a huge artistic movement that blooms, and jazz music and literature that develops that are going to be followed not just by African Americans, but also by white Americans and internationally, which shows people that African Americans are just as capable of whites in producing quality literature, quality art, and that white people can enjoy what African Americans create. Unfortunately, this does not end discrimination and segregation against African Americans. Here are the key concepts for Unit 8. In Unit 8, this is post-World War II to 1980, you begin to see a new internal migration in the United States, which is suburbanization. Now, some suburbs had sprung out before World War II, but this is a huge movement after World War II. You have cheap cars and cheap fuel, which allow people to live further away. You have the building of roads. New housing developments that are affordable begin to spring up in the suburbs, and people flock there due to the increasing prosperity after World War II in the 1950s and 60s. What you begin to see as a result of suburbanization is this idea of conformity and a homogeneous mass culture that develops as a result of living in suburbia. It's also largely populated by white people, and so again you begin to see segregation, that immigrants and African Americans are staying in the cities and the whites are leaving for the suburbs. There are exceptions to this, but that's largely the case. You see an increasing importance on consumerism as a result of suburbanization. Housewives and advertising and things like that lead to a focus on accumulation of stuff. Eventually, you will see challenges to the conformity of suburbanization beginning in the 1960s. Here are the key concepts for Unit 9. In Unit 9, what you see is that you kind of have a combination of several topics: urbanization, suburbanization, and westward expansion. The cities that are growing after 1980 are mostly in the South and the West, and not only the urban areas growing, but the suburban areas. This is largely due to immigration and population increase because of immigration. And that will lead to discussions about immigration in this country, and also the discussion of what it means to be an American and American identity, which we'll discuss in the presentation on American identity. This brings us to the end of Peopling 3. In bringing it all together, and what you should focus on in studying would probably be looking at the different topics: urbanization, suburbanization, westward expansion, and the Great Migration. Causation seems like good questions could come from there. Why are people moving to urban areas, which is a combination of the economic changes of the time period? Or immigration, why people are moving to certain areas because they're immigrating to the country. The other thing that seems likely here is perhaps change over time in urbanization or suburbanization or westward expansion. So those seem to be the most likely choices. We're now moving on to question 2 in the theme of peopling. The first question mainly dealt with why are people coming here? And this one is addressing what the impact of people coming here has on American life. The first one is Peopling 4. Peopling 4. Again, my slides are a little out of order. So, Peopling number 4, the learning objective is analyze the effects that migration, disease, and warfare had on the American Indian population after contact with the Europeans. So this is mostly going to deal with early time periods. And the skills that will be addressed are causation, compare and contrast, and change over time. So it's going to first of all address number 1, unit number 1. And there's finally our Peopling learning objective. So for this particular learning objective, it's looking at the effects that migration, disease, and warfare had on the American Indian population. So the attempt here is to divide this into, is this effect of migration, disease, and warfare, or all of the above? This particular information has to do with Unit 1, and so it's dealing with the Spanish, the initial arrival of the Europeans, especially in Central America and South America. And the impact of the migration is going to be that people are going to die because they're going to get smallpox and they're not going to be able to fight the European weapons. The other thing that happens as a result of migration is, of course, the whole Columbian exchange. The exchange of disease, the exchange of goods, the exchange of ideas, animals, and then also the bringing over of new goods that have an economic impact, one of those being slavery. Horses and cattle are going to be introduced, which is going to bring in a new industry of ranching. Natives are also going to adopt the use of the horse in order to do labor and also to make them more effective in warfare, especially groups who are hunter and gatherers, or what were hunter and gatherers. They're going to use the horse as a means of warfare. In terms of disease and warfare, the Spanish are going to have a huge social impact. Disease is going to knock out a significant part of the native population, which is going to make it easier for the Spanish to conquer the natives that are remaining and to gain control over them. They're going to establish, the Spanish and the Portuguese, establish a racial hierarchy, basically based on how Spanish or how Portuguese you are. They also mix with the natives, and so you create new groups like the mestizo, which is a mix between the Europeans and the natives. They also establish ways to exploit the labor of the natives in the encomienda system. They basically create a system of serfdom where they have to work on lands granted to Spanish or Portuguese settlers. You're also going to see the introduction of slaves into the American society, which also complicates the hierarchy in Spanish and Portuguese, the slaves being at the bottom of that hierarchy. Here is the key concept for Unit 2. The impact of warfare in Unit 2. Now we're talking about after 1607, so this is encompassing the British and the French relationship with the natives, not just the Spanish. You're going to see natives and Europeans clash, especially in Spanish and British colonies. They do to a certain extent in the French, but remember that the French are more interested in building a partnership for the fur trade, and they're settling in areas that are fairly sparsely populated. So the most notable fighting happens between the Spanish and the British. One thing, as we mentioned earlier, that the natives find is that the presence of all these different European groups allows them to play the different European groups off each other to maintain some sort of power in the Americas. As mentioned before, the Spanish come in and want to convert the natives to Catholicism and treat them to become Spaniards, essentially. And a lot of the natives are not so interested in that plan. And what you see is sometimes they revolt. And one example of that is the Pueblo Revolt. And it took the Spanish years to get that under control. And after the Pueblo Revolt, the Spanish become a little bit more careful about how much they try to push on the natives. And so you kind of see a shift in the way that the Spanish treat the natives after the Pueblo Revolt. On the other hand, when the British have conflict with the natives, this tends to kind of further solidify their idea of the natives as an other, as people who need to be separate from them and who need to not be integrated into their culture. One way that you see this happening is that in Massachusetts Bay, the Puritans create praying towns where they're not integrated into the Puritan society, but they convert natives to Christianity, and then they create towns where they're learning how to be more European and be more Christian, that are populated by natives. And these are called praying towns. And after Massachusetts Bay has conflict with the natives in King Philip's War, they become less trusting. And like during King Philip's War, they become less trusting of these praying towns and think that they're working against them when they're really not. And after King Philip's War, these praying towns kind of go away. They're like, oh, we don't see you as really worth this effort anymore. You can't be trusted kind of individuals. So they begin to push the natives away from them rather than integrating the natives into their society. Here's the key concept for Unit 3. Unit 3 covers the time period 1754 to 1800. So it's the growth of American colonies and then the independence of American colonies. And how this is going to affect the Native Americans, because that's what this theme is the impact on Native Americans, is that as the British colonies grow and become more populated, they're going to need more land and resources. And they're going to continue to push the natives westward. And what they do is they push them westward, and then this is the colony or the city or whatever gets bigger, and then they push further, the Europeans push further west, which then pushes the natives further west. So there's continuing clashes along the western borders of the colonies and then states, which creates not only a conflict between the natives, but also a conflict in the states between those who live on the frontier and those who live in the more established areas. Here's the key concept for Unit 6. Unit 6 is 1865 to 1898, so westward expansion. And again, Americans have pushed the natives west, and before the Civil War, natives had moved west, the Trail of Tears, all that, and kind of been promised, hey, this is your area. You stay over here, and we'll stay over here, and everybody will be fine and get along. But as they push further west, creating new states, wanting gold, building railroads, promises that the American government had made to natives about what land was theirs, they begin to go back on it because they want that land. Some of the things that they violate treaties with the natives for are subsidies for railroads. What they're doing is that the government is granting land to the railroads so that they can build the railroad and it not be a prohibitive cost. And what it does is it displaces the natives. And as people expand, they kill the buffalo out of the train windows and all that, and it hugely affect their way of life. Another thing that they do is grant land to colleges for agricultural experiments and things such as that, and giving people better educations about agriculture. But what that does is takes land away from the natives. Another impact from Unit 6 is that the impact of migration is more warfare, and then the impact of warfare is that natives are increasingly pushed onto reservations. So it's kind of the impact of the impact of the impact in this one. So as America expands west, they come into contact with these native groups again, and that leads to warfare between native groups and also native groups and Americans, and specifically the American Army. And what happens is that sometimes the natives slaughter the Americans, and sometimes the Americans slaughter the natives. Examples of the Americans slaughtering the natives would be Sand Creek Massacre and Wounded Knee. Examples of the natives slaughtering the Americans would be Fetterman Massacre and Little Bighorn. One way that the natives try to react to the Americans and fight them off is the ghost dance movement, kind of using native religious beliefs that they can summon the buffalo and bring wrath upon the Americans, and the Americans fear this movement, and that's what leads to the slaughter at Wounded Knee. What eventually happens to the natives is that because they engage in battle with the Americans, and maybe even if they didn't, it would have happened the same way, but they end up on reservations, marginal lands in the American West. At the end of Unit 6, there becomes to be a changing attitude in the country about what should be done with natives. And what is decided is the Dawes Severalty Act should happen. And the idea is that natives should be not living on communal lands on the reservation, but they should be assimilated into American society and offered individual land ownership opportunities, and opportunities to assimilate into American culture. The idea of this is it's well intentioned, but what ends up happening is that Americans encroach more upon native lands, or are able to buy up native lands as a result of the Dawes Act. This brings us to the end of Peopling number 4. Probably the best questions here come from causation, what's leading to what's happening to the natives. You could also see change over time, looking at the beginning periods and how when there's a lot of different European groups present, the natives are able to keep some sort of position of power as they play the groups off each other. But once the other groups disappear and the Americans are here by themselves, they're not able to use the Europeans, or not the Americans are here, but the British are here by themselves, and then the Americans get their independence. They're able to, they don't have that power anymore to play the European groups off one another, and therefore they begin to be pushed back into the West and then onto reservations. The second learning objective, having to do with question 2, how do migrations affect American life, is Peopling number 5. Explain how free and forced migration to and within different parts of North America caused regional development, cultural diversity and blending, and political and social conflicts through the 19th century. So this is asking about anything through the 19th century. There's probably going to be a different learning objective about the 20th century, don't you think, and 21st. The first question, or the first learning objective dealing with question 2, addressed impact on the natives. So this is impact in general on America through the 19th century. So Peopling number 5 is going to address units 1 through 6, so through the 19th century, and it will address all of the historical thinking skills. Here is the key concept for Unit 1. For peopling number 5, it's asking how free and forced migration impacted regional development, cultural diversity and blending, and political and social conflicts. So the specific information I'm giving you, again, I've tried to divide it into those different categories, whatever is appropriate to the unit. So in Unit 1, regional development, basically what you're going to see here is that people are going to migrate to different areas, and whatever's available there is going to determine what kind of economic activities that they participate in, mining, labor, plantation labor, ranching. Cultural diversity is going to emerge as a result of who migrated to that area and how they interacted with the natives. Do they bring natives in as part of the community, or do they separate themselves from the community? And then political and social conflict, you're going to see the Spanish are going to implement a strict social hierarchy, which is going to maintain their superiority at the top. And that's going to create a lot of resentment from those who are not at the top. Here are the key concepts for Unit 2. With the arrival of the British in North America, you see a huge impact on regional development because they come in and bring, with their different goals, and adapt to the landscape of what's there and begin to develop economic activities for their survival and also for trade with Europe. So in the north, they find that there's not a lot for offering up, and so they basically develop small farms. And because of this, they don't have a lot of slavery. In the middle colonies, they have a lot of different economic activities. The middle colonies also are a bit more tolerant of different groups. They're settled by not only the British, but by the Dutch and the Swedes, and therefore you have a lot more cultural diversity in the middle colonies, a lot of economic diversity as well. And then in the Chesapeake and the South, those are mostly developed as colonies for cash crop production, so you're going to see slavery become a big deal in those areas, and the economy geared towards agricultural production. And then in the Caribbean, in the areas controlled by the British, again, it's going to be cash crop, especially sugar-oriented, and the adoption of slavery is going to happen there as well. In terms of cultural diversity, most of the cultural diversity in the British colonies of North America are going to be in the middle colonies. In terms of how they treat the natives, they're either going to be pushed west or encouraged to assimilate to European culture and Christianity. Politically and socially, the big issue that you're going to see is the slavery issue. Areas that agree with it and areas that don't. And then, of course, the creation of laws in areas where slave ownership is huge to make slaves lesser citizens so that they can maintain, the owners can maintain their position of power. Here's the key concepts for Unit 3. As the country is developing, and the British North American, what will become America, country is developing, you also see the Spanish moving into the western part of what will later become the United States, and settling California. Lots of missions are put into place there. You also see cultural diversity and blending that's happening, taking on, you have vaqueros, who are Spanish cowboys, who take on the idea of ranching and cattle drives and all that, and become an important part of the economy of the West. There's not a lot of blending with the natives at this point. In the area settled by the British, in what will become the United States, political and social conflicts emerge in the older parts of the state or the colony, depending on what part of Unit 3 you're talking about. But basically what you see is that the older established part and the frontier part clash because of native conflicts. So as they begin to move further west, they clash with the natives, and the people in the more established area aren't really that concerned about protecting the people in the frontier, spending money on frontier protection. But of course, the people in the frontier are very concerned about native protection. And one of the examples you see of that is the Paxton Boys in Pennsylvania. They go on their own raid and then against the natives, and then attack the more established part of Pennsylvania to get them to do something about natives in the frontier. These are the key concepts for Unit 5. In Unit 5, this is, again, the lead up to end the Civil War. And so regional development is going to be huge. There's been expansion to the west, manifest destiny, and the ongoing debate in the different regions is what should happen with slavery. Of course, in the South, they believe that anywhere there's expansion, there should be slavery, and in the North, they oppose the expansion of slavery. You see attempts to compromise, the Compromise of 1850. They strengthened the fugitive slave law in order to allow California to become a free state, and then to allow states to decide on their own from all the Mexican cession territory can decide on their own whether it will become slave or free states. In the end, this just leads to more conflict, and the Civil War eventually emerges. And California becomes a state. Huge mass exodus to California at this time because of the gold rush, and so they quickly have to make California a state in 1849. In terms of cultural diversity, migrations lead to that as well, of course in the West, but also the Irish and the German immigrants are coming to America and bringing Catholicism with them, and so there's new differences there as well. Political and social conflict, huge political conflict at this time over the issue of states' rights and slavery, which will eventually emerge in the Civil War. You also see conflict with people where borders are placed on them. We talked about Mariano Vallejo before. Here are the Unit 6 key concepts. The big issue for regional development in Unit 6 is the emerging differences between farmers and big business, and how big business seems to be becoming the most powerful force in the United States, and farmers feel like they've been left behind. And as a result of this regional development, you have political and social conflict in the United States, one of the biggest being the creation of the Populist Party to defend the needs of the farmers. This brings us the end of Peopling number 5. The main questions that you'll probably see come from this is causation. How is migration leading to issues in regional development or something like that? The other thing you could see here is taking one of these ideas, regional development, political and social conflict, and seeing a change over time question about what's changed and what stayed the same throughout the period. And now we have learning objective Peopling 6. And this is the third question supporting question number 2. And this is basically the mid-19th through the 20th century version of Peopling number 5. How has migration impacted different aspects of American life in the mid-19th through the mid-20th centuries? So you see units 5, 6, and 7 being addressed. in this learning objective and all of the historical skills again. Here's a key concept for Unit 5. Before we get into the information for Unit 5, what I've done here, talking about the specific information, is address the different topics of Peopling number 6. What it's asking about is how has migration impacted urban life, cultural development, labor issues, and reform movements. So I've kind of tried to address those. A lot of this is becoming a review at this point from other learning objectives, so just kind of remind you of the information we've already discussed. So in Unit 5, we've discussed that immigration, specifically new immigrants from Ireland, are a big issue at this point. So that's going to affect urban life and cultural development. Also labor issues, because they are going to be paid the lowest wages. Here are the key concepts for Unit 6. As discussed before, in Unit 6, immigration is a huge issue. Immigrants are now, there's a shifting in immigration. It's now coming from Asia and Southern and Eastern Europe, as well as you have internal migrations from African Americans in the South to urban areas in the North. Conditions are not great, so labor issues are big, as big business is very much dominant during this time period over the government, and so laborers have a difficult time getting rights. Cities are going to be segregated into areas for African Americans and areas for different immigrant groups. Labor unions, as a result of poor treatment of laborers, are going to grow. So reform movement during this time, you're going to see labor unions grow. The Knights of Labor and the AFL are going to be formed. Remember that labor unions, the Knights of Labor tried to incorporate everyone, but then fell apart. The AFL is mostly about skilled laborers, because unskilled labor is very difficult to unionize because they are so easily replaceable. For Unit 7, the key concept is pretty self-explanatory in what's happening here. The global ramifications of World War I and wartime patriotism and xenophobia, combined with social tensions created by increased international migration, resulted in legislation restricting immigration from Asia and from Southern and Eastern Europe. We talked earlier about the Immigration Act of 1924, which is this is referencing. And so that's going to have a huge impact on who's coming into the country and the impact that it has on cities. Overall, there's a lot of information here that's already been covered in other sections. Again, change over time, how immigration is affecting the growth of cities, or affecting different reform movements at the time, like the need for different reform movements or something like that could be possible. The other thing that's definite possibility here would be causation. So why are people moving to the cities, and why does movement to the cities create need for labor unions or what have you? So those are kind of the most popular questions there. At last, we've come to the last learning objective for Peopling, Peopling 7. And of course my slide is out of order. Peopling 7 says, explain how and why debates over immigration to the United States have changed since the turn of the 20th century. And this therefore addresses the 20th century units, Unit 7, Unit 8, and Unit 9. Causation, compare and contrast, and change over time are all ideas here. Change over time seems strong. Or comparing and contrasting different pieces of legislation seem like something that could happen here. I didn't put it on here, but as I speak, it occurs to me that periodization could become important as well, as, you know, why is the idea changing? Like, and when does the shift happen between this is an appropriate piece of legislation, this is an appropriate way to deal with immigration, and this is not? You know, how does that play into it? And here is our slide on the learning objective. So here's the topic, Peopling 7. Explain how and why debates over immigration to the United States have changed since the turn of the 20th century. And here's our key concept for Unit 7. And our key concept for Unit 8. And our key concept for Unit 9. Essentially, what you're being asked here is to take all of the ideas that have been presented in other sections of the learning objectives, the different immigration laws that are happening, and how those have changed over time. First of all, you look at periodization. The first time you really see laws about immigration in this country is in 1924 with the Quota Acts. So, first of all, that the American people are now seeing a reason to make laws about immigration. And then in 1965, you see, oh, well, it's probably not nice to ban certain groups from coming into the country. And so maybe we should open that up and rethink the way we feel about immigration. And so that's the prevailing opinion until the 1980s, where the concern shifts again to now it's not about who's coming in, like which groups, as much as it is about are they coming in legally or illegally. Now, arguably, there's still an issue about groups and whether they're coming in like what groups are coming in legally and illegally. But the shift is not, that becomes the shift, is illegal versus legal immigration, and that pretty much prevails to the modern time period. The continuity in all of this, of course, is that people feel threatened by immigration because it challenges new groups coming in, challenges the American identity, what it means to be an American, and then it's also a question of jobs. And, of course, immigrants are going to be targeted the most in times of economic instability.